right, what's up? I'm not great at recording things because as I said potentially to you guys before, I moved into admin before the pandemic, and I wasn't teaching, so I don't really have all the technical skills to do these kinds of things. So hopefully this works out pretty well. I'm probably going to be covering up some of the titles on the PowerPoint, but I'll make the PowerPoint available later in case you really want to know exactly what's going on here. But this is me recording this on Friday, March 20th. So this is not like an old lecture that I am pulling out of my back pocket. So some of the content is, but not the video itself. So really, this is the first lecture of just getting more background into what the UN is doing. I'm going to adhere pretty closely to the textbook, but when I was first gathering these notes to create this class, I definitely think I was drawing on a lot more than just what the textbook was looking at. So, based on my rereading of the textbook, so hopefully I'll be adding something that's not just me rehashing a lot of what happens in the text. But you know me, I sometimes do that anyway. So, um, let's get to it. So we're going to talk about actors in the UN. So that's kind of like a vague thing, right? Unless you've taken, my IR class where we talk about actors in international relations. Um, uh, you know, um, there are entities out there, right? So what does it really mean to be an actor? So we're talking about a couple things when it comes to an actor and its level of actorness. So we have authority, representation, legitimacy from some political process that happens. Doesn't have to be democracy, but there has to be some legitimacy. Claim to represent a society. So that is sort of what an actor in the UN is going to do. It doesn't have to be a society like a nation state, but it could be like a society of people existing in the world. And actors, they exert influence on creating and resolving political conflicts. So I think that's exactly kind of from MKL. But what does it mean to be an actor in world society is a question we want to confront first, and then we'll get into the details, the nitty gritty. So, um, states are clearly actors in the UN system. We've talked about how the UN privileges states. It's created by states for states. The Secretariat, right? So we're looking at all the things that Antonio Guterres and the Secretariat, well, he's a Secretary General, but the actual like executive branch and bureaucracy of the UN is kind of an actor, right? But we're not really sure what it's like, right? Like how much authority it really has, because they're sort of unelected bureaucrats. They're approved, sure, but um, it's the same sort of democratic deficit questions we see in other democracies, if we can consider the UN one. And then what about NGOs and global civil society? So we'll come to these three things one at a time, right? So we're going to talk about states, then we'll talk about the Secretariat, and then we'll talk about a little bit about NGOs and global civil society and sort of how they are all actors, right? So there's this kind of spectrum, and sorry for my bad handwriting, but you're used to it now probably, of actorness. Uh, Yeah. So just imagine this was on the whiteboard. Anyway, I drew it out on my iPad. So we have the spectrum of actorness, and so probably my face is covering something here. Yeah. So it's covering authoritarian and dem over this last state, so democratic on the far right here. Uh, so it's the capacity to act, usually in expanding issue areas. It's the capacity to influence the external environment. My cat just jumped off the bed. And it's the cohesion, and cohesion is key. So the Secretariat is doing things that on its own might be a problem, potentially. So this isn't really definitive necessarily, right? This is sort of my reading on things, right? And what I get out of the textbook. Because I don't really think about things in this way, but it is kind of interesting to think about who has the most agency, right? So democratic states, that makes more sense potentially that they have a lot of actorness because they have a lot of legitimacy bestowed upon them. because it's a government that's elected. Authoritarian states, maybe not so much, right? But they're still states within the UN system, so they still have a lot of weight, right? Because it's a system for states by states. The Security Council is even higher because they're mostly, well, not really mostly anymore, but they're Democrats, but they are conferred some legitimacy as well because not all of them are democratic states, of course, because they have a lot of military power and economic power. So they have a lot of ability to be sort of an actor in the United Nations system. The Secretariat is less than the states, so the Secretariat can't really do anything on its own um, without states at least saying that's fine, you should do that, or we'll let you like do it because we don't care about it. Like it's a problem that we don't want to deal with. Um, and then the Secretary General is even less because he's just one guy who potentially is just saying words, as we saw with some of the press releases that we analyzed. And then coalitions. So coalitions among states um, have actorness in and of themselves. So, like the European Western powers have some sort of actorness as a coalition. Authoritarian states, they have actorness as a coalition, potentially to the extent they agree with one another, which rarely happens. So that's why coalitions are a little bit further down here, down the line on my scribbled actorness thing, right? And then the UN itself doesn't always act that much on its own, right? It's usually the Security Council or the states themselves who get, legitimacy from the UN to do something. So the UN itself we rarely think that the UN is doing something, right? We often think that states within the UN or the UN has acquiesced to something that states want to do, or the Secretary General has led some sort of technical commission or something, right? And then NGOs and civil society are down here at the bottom, right? So they have actorness in the sense that they exist and they have goals, but it's a little tricky for them to be able to, for us as social scientists, to say that they actually have a lot of freedom to act because they have to first probably talk to the UN, think about the coalitions. They have to think about, is the Security Council going to be upset, and then actually talk to states, right? So, and we'll come back to what NGOs and civil society are doing within the UN system later. So let's start with the great powers. Now that we got the actorness theory sort of out of the way. The great powers. All right, so the U.S. All right, so this is kind of like history, but also trying to update it to sort of like what's going on now, but also each of the great powers today, and historically, have particular approaches to international organizations that seem to carry on pretty consistently across time and across leadership in the countries, aside from essentially Trump. Right, so Trump is a major outlier when it comes to sort of the behavior of the great powers. But generally, we can say that the United States created the international system post 1945, and of course now is destroying it, but created this international system, including the UN, right? Other states were involved, of course. I mentioned that NGOs and human rights groups and activists and women's groups and things like that were invited to San Francisco for the creation of the UN. Those two San Francisco conferences that created the UN. But from a realist perspective, especially, we might say, well, let's just say that the UN was created because the US said we should do this. So it kind of created this international system of states as opposed to nations, as opposed to peoples, as opposed to I don't know what, right? Regions, right? So the UN created this international system of states. So it seeks and provides the collective legitimation of its actions at the UN, right? So it went to the UN to get approval for the Korean War, for the Cuban Missile Crisis, for the Iran hostage crisis in the 1970s, the Gulf War, 1970s, 1980, I suppose, the Gulf War, and response to the 9/11 attacks. So in the 1960s and 80s, though, it was pretty ambivalent towards the UN for whatever reason. Part of it was the escalation between the Soviet Union and the U.S. in terms of like proxy wars and building nuclear weapons and things like that. So note that Vietnam is not on this above list, right? So yeah, so that's sort of from there, right? So then we get into the 1990s. Clinton is missing here, um, but on the slide. But Clinton, he basically um, wanted to use the UN, but kind of got cold feet because a bunch of the missions didn't go well in the 1990s that were led by the U.S. Um, via the UN. The NATO stuff was different, right? That's a separate question. But anything the U.S. did via the UN, Clinton was a little bit nervous about that. So it's kind of like Clinton was of two minds about intervening using the UN, right, in other nations. Kind of, he was a combination of America first and also like we should engage with everybody. So he was sort of waffled on the question of how much to use the UN. Bush, on the other hand, he used the UN. He wanted to use the UN as much as possible. George W. Bush. So he wanted to use the UN to legitimate its actions in Afghanistan and through the global war on terror, right? So the global war on terror, right, basically getting everyone on board to the idea that NATO and the US could kill terrorists anywhere in the world at any time for any reason. Well, maybe not any reason. But to sort of legitimate those actions because it was unprecedented that, you know, we could fly a drone into a random base somewhere in the desert and kill some terrorists. So he wanted to make sure there was agreement there with the UN. Obama also did the UN for that same reason, and then he re-engaged with the UN on other areas. So one thing that George W. Bush did was not get permission for the war in Iraq. He also was anti-abortion around the world, and so pulled out of a couple of international agreements. That's always been consistent with Republican presidents. So Obama gets elected, and he re-engaged with the UN. Thought it was an important thing to do, especially with regard to waging the global war on terror. That we wanted as much cooperation as possible. Um, what we see here between the Bush and Obama years is how good, how well the U.S. government is functioning seems to affect its ability to use the UN institutions to their advantage. So in the George W. Bush years, there was a lot of dysfunction, just to say the least. And despite it seeming like everything is fine relative to how Trump is behaving, there was a lot of dysfunction in the Obama years between the hawks versus the doves. So while Obama was re-engaging with the UN, still wasn't really able to use it effectively because there was there was a mismatch between what he wanted to do and what the deep state, as Trump calls it, or the tankies, as we call them now, wanted to do with regard to U.S. power. And then, of course, it's in Trump's first term, and then Biden re-engages everything. Right, he's basically like Obama on steroids. And we're just going to skip over him. Sorry, Biden, but Trump has completely abdicated leadership in the UN, and so we're wondering if maybe China is going to walk in and try to be the leader. Um, Part of the like overarching questions that we might think about as, you know, like from a deeper level and not just informational level is, was the UN really just, or is the UN really just the US and its power when it comes to especially the principal sort of reasons that the UN exists, you know, peace and security? Because it sure seems like the U.S. has to be on board and has used the UN effectively when it wants to do something from the peace and security kind of thing. But the other kind of functions maybe fall off, and we can talk about that a little bit in terms of it being on the Western or the UN or the U.S. agenda. So we're wondering if in walks China, right? Does that mean that the UN is now not a Western organization? The Soviet Union. So are they West or are they not? We're always confused about what Russia and the Soviet Union are. They West or are they South? We're not really sure, right? Are they East? Who knows? They're ambiguous on that question themselves. So they tend to have adopted a negative attitude at the UN, very negative. If you look at some old clips, cynical attitude, which isn't surprising if you've read Russian literature. But they demonstrate this with vetoes at the Security Council. So lots and lots of vetoes at the Security Council over the years since 1945. They supported the new international economic order, which I think we discussed or was discussed in the last chapter. Just a new way of thinking about the global economic system. And they also supported developing nations during the Cold War. So they would always offer, some kind of money, right? So it'd be like, hey, we can give you a small amount of money if you'll be voting with us at the UN, or if you want to say communism isn't that bad, right? They did that during the Cold War. Russia voted with the U.S. in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed, but that ended over disagreements in U.S. and NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1998-99. Why that is, gotta look it up. It's deep history there. Russia tried to take leadership on the issue of Iran's nuclear problem. I should say Iran's nuclear problem via the P5+1 initiative, which has, this has sort of fallen into recent history. Like, we don't really remember what this was about, but didn't necessarily work. One thing that happened was they got preoccupied with the Syrian civil war. It sort of took their eyes off the prize when it came to leadership on Iran's nuclear program and trying to figure out how to make it so they're not getting nukes. That's one thing to emphasize, like also with Russia's involvement in the Security Council and the UN. They were very much on board with the U.S. that other powers shouldn't have nuclear weapons, right? It should just be the ones who already have them. And so it makes sort of sense that they would be involved in making sure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, even if they're friendly with them. Let's see if there's other notes here. Yes. Oh, the last part here. Yeah. Russia is continuously suspicious that the U.S. or the West is trying to deny it great power status through international institutions. So that's part of their negative attitude towards the UN, is they think that all the UN really is a way for the West to keep Russia down, right? That they have a huge victim complex. Of course, Russia does. So they veto some weird things, right? So they vetoed the Security Council resolution declaring the invasion of Crimea as illegal. I guess that's not weird because they did it. But they also vetoed an investigation of the Malaysian airliner that they shot down in Ukraine, which they tried to blame on rebels or some shadowy groups, but they still said, no, we're not going to have an investigation into that. They also vetoed the investigation in Srebrenica. Did I say that right? But that's the Kosovo genocide, Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic. Google it if you want to look it up, or ask Michael Savage about it. And they have a pretty low assessment. And assessments are based on GDP, essentially, per capita. So they actually don't pay as much money to the UN as the other great powers. So only 2.2% of the budget comes from their 2.2% of the budget from the UN comes from Russia, whereas in the Soviet Union days, when they had money, it was about 8%. Also, there were more countries involved, right? The Russian Federation is much smaller than the Soviet Union was. France, how'd they get there? Yeah, how'd they get there? Well, they try to do a lot of stuff that makes them seem important. All right, so they take a very active role in peacekeeping efforts. They say a lot of stuff about being a leader in NATO as well, but it's not necessarily the UN. So at least from the UN situation and their relationship to the UN, they're mostly about peacekeeping. They have a lot of experts in the World Bank and the IMF, and of course, France is pretty wealthy, right? So it sort of makes sense that they would get involved in those institutions relative to, they're probably like the fifth wealthiest country in the world. It consistently votes with large countries on the issues of the day, keeps close ties to former colonies. France also tried to mediate the New International Economic Order agenda and the Global North opposition to change. And part of this is because they maintain ties, pretty close ties to those former colonies, right? So they have a pretty, they think, right, according to them, maybe it's paternalistic, but they have close ties to the former colonies. France has wanted or wants to have a common European position on issues, so it sees itself as a leader of Europe because it has a veto vote on the P5 and is a P5 member. And so while Germany is more powerful these days, it wants to be this international leader, and it has always been. It's not just Emmanuel Macron, right? It's been lots and lots of French leaders historically. Even if Marine Le Pen was elected, well, she's not going to be elected because she's in prison. But what's his name? Shoot, I forget who the new National Rally is. Anyway, the far right leader in France, if he gets elected, he's probably still going to, even though he's skeptical of the UN, he's probably still going to be like, we should lead, Europe when it comes to international issues, and we should all be united on them. Great Britain and the UK. So you'll see a similar scenario here, right? Has had an active role in peacekeeping activities, is a prominent player in the World Bank and the IMF, also a very rich country, the US, and has expertise in capitalism. The UK votes consistently with large developed countries and keeps ties to former colonies, especially those in the Commonwealth. And the UK has supported most of the US wars. So I say US war, should be plural there. The only exception really is this one today in Iran. And it's been kind of surprising to hear the UK Prime Minister basically say, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to come help, right? But the UK has generally supported all the US wars in any other, right? And then the US vice versa. But the UK doesn't really go to war anymore because they're not as powerful as they used to be. Anyway, the UK receives positions on restricted membership bodies, which was part of that huge map of, the UN bureaucracy, right, and the structure. So it's because they had experience with international society, right? So they sort of created the previous international system. Great Britain did. And so there's a lot of expertise when it comes to, and sure, that might have been unfair, right? They're an empire, right? And they were exploiting people, but they sort of understand. They have a lot of expertise when it comes to dealing with different interests, different people, different countries, right? They know a lot about dealing with the world. And so they have a lot of expertise and experience. So if you look at who's working on projects that the UN cares about, sort of at the UN website, or if you're representing the UK in the simulations, right? Just sort of think about that you have a lot more cachet at the UN than the other great powers when it comes to expertise, experience, and diplomacy. And the UK is sort of similar to France's situation and opposes UN reform because if we reassessed sort of the power today in the world, Britain would lose out. So they have a pretty privileged position in the UN right now based on the 1945 framework, and they don't want to give that up. China, how'd they get there is also a question, right? So I sort of like waved that away because, there used to be an Asian power, but, it was kind of crazy, right? So China's not very rich, obviously. But they were allies with the US in the war, right, against Japan. So they're in the P5, which means they have a veto vote. But for the first 35 years, they basically didn't do anything in the UN. It makes sense, right? If you think about the history of China, just trying to develop Cultural Revolution, mass not genocide, well, now genocide, but mass famine, right? Just millions and millions of people dying. Like, it was a bad experience in China for the first 35 years post 1945. So, especially the first 5 years when there was a civil war going on. So the idea was that China was going to be a democratic or, satellite maybe not democratic, but at least Western allied state with Chiang Kai-shek, visited the U.S., was prominent at the San Francisco conference in the creation of the UN, was best friends with Truman. They were like actually like best friends in the way that Trump thinks that he's best friends with other folks. Right. So, but then Mao wins the Civil War and Chiang Kai shek goes to Taiwan. So, bad luck, right? Kind of. And so China just doesn't have the power to really do much at the UN for the first 35 years. It mostly just simply voted with the G77, so the developing countries, on all the issues. Market reforms, they changed everything in 1980, 79, 80s. So they immediately became involved in the World Bank and the WTO and the IMF, in part because they wanted money, but also because they realized they were a big power and they could direct that money to allies. But before that, because they're super communist, they didn't want to have anything to do with capitalism. So those market reforms really sort of changed everything. The barrier to their participation in a lot of things has been their lack of respect for human rights. All right, so yeah, basic human rights and respecting them, and other international norms, especially norms about the environment. They would, especially during the Cultural Revolution, the Mao years, they would just level forests, right, and just be like, who cares, right? We need to industrialize it all at all costs. Sort of happened again under Hu Jintao, when they had more resources to industrialize and there was pollution everywhere. Sort of scaled back a little bit there on the environment, but environmental destruction, but still sort of an issue, right? So they don't really have a role to play in many of the initiatives that the UN puts forward. They have a pattern of abstaining on major votes, especially on the Security Council in the 1990s and forward. They still sort of do it. So I put until very recently, but I actually put that there and then went and looked, and it seems like they're still kind of ambivalent on a lot of issues. They want to seem like they're on everyone's side, and so they're still abstaining a lot when it comes to UN Security Council votes. They have a large role in peacekeeping missions, so a lot of Chinese troops out there trying to keep the peace after conflicts or before conflicts emerge. And of course, they've had a lot of changing interests in light of their rapid development over the years. Now, of course, they're sort of undeveloping a little bit with their economy crashing, but they're still have changed their interests. They aren't as much in that voting with the G77. Other things to note, right? So they're big fans of sovereignty and non-intervention. So what that means is they've had some weird positions in terms of weird and maybe unpopular should be what we say. So they vetoed or didn't vote when Russia vetoed or didn't vote. They've generally been on the side of the 77, but they've also were not cool with action in Darfur. So they viewed that as a civil war in violation, and so like intervening in it would be in violation of the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention at the UN. It sort of makes sense because if you think about the Uyghur situation, the genocide that the U.S. declared, either the Biden administration said it was genocide. The UN has called it a genocide as well. Just that China has vetoed those kinds of things, right? So they're calling their genocide in their borders a civil war, right? And so they're sort of hearkening back to, look, this same thing happened in Darfur and South Sudan, and so we think this is about not intervening in other people's business. Now, right now, because there's a leadership void with the UN sort of exiting, or the US sort of exiting, China potentially is now the de facto leader when it comes to this. So we'll see what this like history that they have at the UN, what effect it actually has on the UN moving forward, because the US is no longer really participating in good faith. Maybe neither is China. Who is still participating in good faith? Germany. All right. So they're not a P5, but they're a great power. They only gained membership in 1973, so I sort of like misstated how you gain membership in the UN last class. Or it's like it's universal membership, but you do have to contribute some money. So, I think that's mostly the barrier to membership in the UN. So East Germany and West Germany, they only gained membership in 1973. Why is that? Partly because it took a while for the economy to grow again. Um, but also the idea that West Germany was kind of like controlled by the West and East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. Germany is a significant financial contributor today, especially in financial terms, to peacekeeping operations, but does not tend to commit many troops. There's still a portion of both Japan, which we'll come to in a second, and Germany's constitutions slash laws that are passed that they can't legally deploy troops unless they're attacked. Um, so usually the troops that are deployed are more like experts in something, right? Like they're engineers, right? They're not necessarily like infantry. Um, so they do a lot of money. It's a rich country, so they can contribute that, and they also pay more than its share of the UN budget, so they overpay on their assessment. Part of this is that they want permanent UN Security Council membership. So Germany sometimes is on it, but sometimes is not. We see that they're not on it right now, right? They fall in and out of the Security Council. So that wouldn't necessarily mean getting a veto, but they'd like to be permanently on the UN Security Council. And so they want UN reform that reflects the contemporary distribution of power. This is very similar to Japan, their outlook, right? They gained membership earlier in 1956. And kind of like China, they kept a low profile at first, which isn't surprising considering how much they had run amok in Asia. And so they wanted to not disturb people for a while, right? So their first action was really to try to keep the People's Republic of China, so the Mao, the communists' version of China, out of the UN. Sort of worked, but that was their main first thing to do in the UN. They are also a significant financial contributor to peacekeeping operations. Same boat, not many troops, right? So it's sort of constitutional that they shouldn't even have an army. In Japan, they're changing it, they're reforming it now, especially in light of the North Korean threat and the Chinese threat. But theoretically, Japan only has a defensive army, so sending them somewhere else to do something seems like it's offensive, right? It's an offensive operation. They have been historically supportive of the Palestinian cause. So, for whatever reason, the Japanese governments, especially the conservative governments, have been supportive of the Palestine, Palestinians, them getting their independence, etc. Stands out among the great powers. That's why it's worth mentioning. It pays way more than its share of the UN budget. Way more, so more than Germany. Then it's assessment, right? So they definitely value it. Of course, the U.S. does the same thing, even though Trump doesn't like that. And they want membership, just like Germany, right? They want reform that reflects the contemporary distribution of power. So those are the great powers. What about the middle powers? So I think it's nice that the book says these are traditional middle powers because we're trying to think about the like before the UN and after the UN, or not after, but during the UN, right? You know, sort of like who these other powers are. And um, recently, the Canadian Prime Minister tried to revive this idea that there are these middle powers. Carney did in Canada with a speech that everyone really liked in Switzerland, or Munich, I should say. You can Google that if you want. It's kind of boring to listen to, but it was a good speech. Anyway, trying to get these powers together: Canada, Australia, Norway, Sweden, Argentina, Brazil, India, South Africa, Nigeria. So countries that can both be leaders and followers. Historically, these middle powers have helped facilitate peacefully major power transitions that are inevitable. So, like The middle powers, these middle powers in particular, helped facilitate the transition between the UK being the major power in the world and then the US taking over, without there being a war between the US and the UK. And so they have a big role to play. For example, if when, probably more like if, I'm still skeptical on this, China overtakes the US in terms of power, right? To make sure there's not going to be a war. We already see that a little bit with Canada, right? Welcoming Chinese leadership to the country over the past couple weeks. They had more freedom to act during the Cold War, because it was the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. They were just sort of at loggerheads, and so the middle powers had a lot of freedom. Okay, all my notes are on that one slide. That's weird. Okay. They're also frequent contributors of peacekeeping troops. So let's start with Canada. So Canada, in particular, has a political culture that's pretty commensurate with UN ideals, right? And so this pluralism, meaning that we're all different people, but we can come together and rally around a particular cause, is very Canadian. And it's also very United Nations. They're also very much concerned with diplomacy first, sanctions second, and war last. So there was a rapid decrease in troops that they had available to the UN. They used to contribute about 120,000 troops down to 118. That's like literally 118 under Harper. That was from 1998 to 2018. When did Trudeau take over? 2015, 16. So there was a major decrease in the number of troops that Canada was contributing to UN actions. If you look up footage from the interventions in Kosovo, etc., in the 1990s, it's tons of Canadians. But they pulled back under the conservative leadership of Harper. Focuses on human security and climate change, still doing that quite a bit. Didn't win a vote, so they actually had a vote to elect Canada potentially to a permanent seat on, so not P5, but P6 then, I guess, because Harper, Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister of Canada before Justin Trudeau, was kind of bad at being a diplomat. So he kind of bungled things. And Canada, therefore, does not have a permanent seat. I'll have to find you the Down in Kosovo parody, because the Canadians were the ones who were responsible for that. I couldn't find it. I need to find it. I gotta find it. It's funny. We'll play it in actual class. I won't do it on this. A viral video from like 1998. So just think about what that's gonna look like. I just played that leprechaun thing, but think about 10 years earlier before that. Okay, Australia. All right, so Australia is a big UN supporter. They have committed troops for some interventions in Papua New Guinea and East Timor. They tend to lead and create coalitions when they're at the UN, especially on agricultural issues, when it comes to especially fairness and inclusivity. So that's just their lane. So one thing you'll note with the middle powers' behavior in the UN is they all sort of potentially try to get their own lane. So Canada is about committing troops and pluralism, right? Human security and climate change. Australia, agriculture. Nigeria, they're a proponent of the ECOWAS, so that's the East African International Regional Organization. The Economic Community of Western, so I shouldn't say East, that was bad. The Economic Community of West African States led interventions in Liberia and Sierra Leone and subsequent others that I should have looked up and I forgot to. But they're trying to be a regional leader in Africa, right? So they aided the intervention in South Sudan, but not this time. So the first time in the Civil War, but not this time. And Boko Haram, the terrorist group, Islamist terrorist group, their activities is kind of limiting their leadership capacities because they're preoccupied with that. So we're sort of like leaderless in Africa right now because of Boko Haram messing things up. Did I skip one slide? No. India. So India, biggest democracy in the world, right? By a lot. To the extent we still think they're a democracy. But they've been longtime participants in peacekeeping operations in the Middle East and Africa. And part of them doing this, to be cynical politicians, right, is they're angling for a permanent Security Council seat, as well as being altruistic, right? And this is true from successive administrations. It's been happening. It doesn't matter who the leader is. They see this as an avenue to pursuing more power in the international system. They were the leader of the Non-Aligned Movement, or NAM. So basically the countries that were not on the side of the US or the Soviet Union, didn't want to be. And so they've always sort of espoused an activist multilateral agenda that is sort of outside the great powers, right? One thing to note about India is they might be a spoiler, and especially so with new leadership in Modi. They didn't sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's the NPT listed here. And they actually pretended secretly that they didn't have nuclear weapons for a couple years. So they had nuclear weapons, but said, "Yeah, we don't have them. We don't have them. Nope. No, what are you talking about?" And so they actually had them, but they had to be constructed. So there were parts of the nuclear weapons in various spaces, and so they could have plausible deniability that we don't actually have a nuclear weapon ready to go, right? We have to put it together first. Anyway, so they sort of hid their ability to have a nuclear bomb. Also, as a spoiler, right? They have a lot of carbon dioxide emissions, and they're only going to increase as the country industrializes. So it's possible they will want to pull out of climate agreements like the U.S., right? They have a really low assessment fee because of poverty/population, right? So it's less than 1% of the UN budget because it's still so poor. So India is important, it's big, but it's very poor. Brazil, also big, also important, and a little less poor than India. So in the 1990s, Brazil contributed to peacekeeping in the former Portuguese colonies. So they actually sent their troops over to Africa because they had cultural experience, I suppose, with what it's like to be a former Portuguese colony. They commanded the UN forces in Haiti, and I actually looked this up because I thought it was somebody else. But they still are commanding it. They are not necessarily the people on the ground, but they're still commanding it in Haiti. Obviously, it's not going great right now, which might explain. Maybe it's because Brazil troops aren't there, right? But if you look at the history of Brazil, for better or worse, they have a lot of experience in military affairs, right? Because they had a military government, so they sort of know what they're doing, especially if they're going to be involved in military plus governance. So combining development projects with the military is one of the expertise, right? It's Brazil's lane. Again, they're doing some of this stuff at the UN because they want a permanent Security Council seat. All right, so they've also demonstrated a willingness to reduce carbon emissions depending on who's the president, right? They dismantled their nuclear program in the 1990s. They also had sort of secret nuclear weapons, but they actually got rid of them. I think that's the only country that got rid of them. It's hard for me to think of what country that got rid of them willingly. But Brazil, I think there might have been another one, but Brazil got rid of their nuclear program willingly in the 1990s. They pay more money to the UN than Russia. And political turmoil for a while in the 2015 to 2020 era was sort of eroding their prestige. A lot of corruption, but now they've demonstrated sort of that they're working on corruption with the late president's Bolsonaro. His arrest for his role in organizing a coup has increased their prestige. Now, depends on who you ask, of course. Like Trump doesn't like that, but the rest of the world seems to. I think that was a good sign that Brazil is trying to take on leadership. Okay, let me find the notes here. Small and developing states. All right, so what about the small states? What are they doing? Not much. Well, they're doing something, right? So, membership in the UN is seen as a status symbol. So, if they can afford their assessments, they're like, we must be good, right? We're in good standing internationally. The UN is seen as a cost efficient form to conduct multilateral and bilateral stuff, whatever it is, right? Diplomacy, trade, whatever. The UN is a place for these small and developing countries to develop international law that constrains the behavior of great powers. So the talk shop, right, actually matters for developing nations because the more they talk about things, the more precedent is out there to create bodies of international law that constrains, Russia from invading a small state somewhere or the U.S. from bombing Iran. Oh well, so much for that. But it's a place to constrain the behavior of great powers. It also enlarges the voice of small states because one state, one vote. And so they can actually have an outsized influence on setting the global agenda. Okay, you can still see me. It's getting darker out. Strategies. So, if you're a small state in the Model UN, you might want to think about these strategies, right? Okay, so it's going to be less important for the Security Council when there's only 15, but when we do a more randomized draft for the General Assembly, you may end up finding yourself as one of these really small, poor countries, right? So, what they engage in is imaginative diplomacy, trying to really think about new ways of talking to people, talking to other countries to um, find solutions to problems. And the more ingenuity they display, the more prestige they get, and the more people like that country, right? And the more likely they'll say good things about them, right? And so they try to punch above their weight, be better at some things than the great powers, than the middle powers, like really specialize in something that they participate in. We call this forum shopping. So the smaller powers may not have the resources to participate in all of the UN stuff, right, that they could, but they will specialize. They have a couple experts who are really good at something, right, that might fit their specific interests. A lot of vote trading as well, so that's a strategy, right? I'll vote for this if you give me X, or something else, right? Kind of like the U.S. Congress or the British Parliament. Developing states, they recognize that they are the beneficiaries of UN development and other programs. And so they realize that rich nations, they pay in cash, but poor nations, they pay in blood. And so, sort of realizing that reality can help them sort of navigate the strategies of diplomacy at the UN. So let me pause it right here. I'll be right back. All right, I realize this is going much more quickly than it would if I was asking you guys questions. So, oh well, it's just short. That's fine. Actually, I don't know how short it is. Has it been 48 minutes? I guess we're going pretty long. Okay, just a few things left in this chapter. So coalitions, which is also like we're reading about it academically, but it's going to help you out potentially to act like your country when you're in the Mali UN, right? And so this is funny because I don't know. I should have gotten a better screenshot here, but this is from old back in the day, and I thought it'd be funny to do this. I actually took a picture of the printed page. Anyway, which block does your country belong to, right? That's something to think about, right? So we have the regional groups and we have the other multilateral groups. The EU tends to be a pretty good block. They vote together. I know we talked about France being a leader in that regard. They don't always vote together on issues of security, but everything else, they're pretty reliable. If you're a European nation, you should talk to your other European groups, right? So there are even European representatives themselves who are seated as observers We're not going to have those necessarily, but just think about there's a lot more diplomats from Europe than there are from other regions. Um, these coalitions kind of are based in historical experiences. So, especially with the Cold War, and they somehow still persist, right? So, the African group, the Asian Pacific group, and these other multilateral groups, right? So, the Group of 77 still sort of exists, even though that seems like a relic of the Cold War, right? We're talking about the 1990s, right? That's 35 years ago, right? Um, but we still see that they exist and tend to vote together. We see that with voting patterns, even if they don't talk about the Group of 77 anymore. We also see that ASEAN is actually pretty consistent with them voting together. The non aligned movement doesn't really exist, but yet their voting patterns, again, are still very similar. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is a caucus or a regional group here in, not regional, but a caucus within the UN. So if you're an Islamic state, keep that in mind. The Nordic group, Scandinavia, and the European Union, as we said. So there's also a UN Democracy Caucus, which they tend to push for good governance and democratic norms. They tried to democratize UN programs specifically. The Commonwealth, so the UK Commonwealth and their group of folks, they tend to vote together, the former states of the British Empire. And then smaller groups of 3 to 6 states, which we call contact groups, they tend to work together on a particular issue or region. Friends groups is another way for saying it. So if you're looking for information on your state or your country that you're representing, just know all those terms, right? Because knowing how they vote, like we're not competing, right? And you're just getting a grade. But if we were to try to take our group of folks to New York for a Model UN or something like that, or I guess does Dallas have one? Who knows? We would try to be competing for awards. And one way to win awards is to rally your regional group, your caucus, because it really demonstrates an understanding of the interests of other countries. And so this is the caucusing blogs. I can't remember if this is in the book or I found this somewhere else, but it might be in the book. Um, there's a lot of overlap, right? It's kind of confusing here, right? But if you want to know where your country votes, yeah, go for it. Interestingly, members of no group, Israel and the United States, they do not tend to have a consistent voting pattern, whereas other allies of Israel and the United States do. Um, but the US and Israel are sort of alone in how they vote. Russia might be kind of there these days. Where is Russia? Interesting. Why can't I find Russia? Well, you probably have found it by now. Anyway, think about where Russia might be. um, oh yeah, the other one is OPEC. So the oil producing states, OPEC, they tend to vote together as well. It's not listed here, I don't think. No. Okay. So just think about OPEC too. If your state is a member of OPEC, one of those Arab oil producing states. All right, and then finally, the Secretary General. Well, we're not finally because we've got the NGOs next, but the Secretary General is all about in the UN maintaining objectivity, neutrality, and impartiality, and it's meant to be an office that stands apart from the selfishness that states tend to communicate to one another. And so when they were designing this, they actually were thinking about this, that we needed to have a secretary general that seems like a moral leader, right? One that's divorced from politics. Of course, when you read the statements, you obviously, from the secretary general, we obviously know that there's politics, but it's meant to be objective, neutral, and impartial. That said, they take orders from member states, right? So that's the administrative part. But also they give orders because they're kind of like the president, right, of the United States. and so they're a leader. But they really do try for neutral communication and being an intermediary for the global community. And they use the tools, right? The bully pulpit, right? Like the president had before they had everything else in the U.S., right? So the diplomacy and the power of persuasion, trying to be one of those good guys who gets along with everybody, right? So other thing that happens with the Secretary General is they go for big ideas, bold action, and they push the bounds of delegated responsibilities. So kind of just like the president, right? But they go for the big ideas, things that they know that won't really happen, right? But they want to at least put it out there so that way people are thinking about it. So, it's kind of like one of those things. Do you want a competent and efficient manager? Do you want a weak individual who's not exercising leadership? Or do you want an independent figure who leads a powerful bureaucracy? It has sort of evolved over time, but from what my reading of it is that the Secretary General for now has been more of someone who's going for these big ideas and bold action, rather than really being a leader in the UN. That might be why he's the longest serving Secretary General right now. The Secretariat is the bureaucracy, right? So technocrats rule, right? The UN is full of a bunch of technocrats, just like the EU is. And people complain about this, right? We said the 55,000 people who work for the Secretariat, right? But this expertise, it shapes their worldview. So what experts see as problems and the solutions they propose are limited in scope. All right, they have the power to define what counts as an issue and what an issue actually is. And because the Secretary General is not elected by the world like the President of the United States is, they're really beholden to the expertise of the technocrats, as what is sort of like on the agenda and what a solution is. So if you decide you want to go into the foreign service or something, right? Get a PhD, master's degree, something. You could get a job at the UN and really define sort of what is on the international agenda, because there's not much to check you, right? So you're an expert because you're an expert. People like you, sure, so they don't think you're like some radical or something. But you can really define what's on the international agenda just via expertise. That said, that could be a problem, right? So the organizational culture at the UN, that's a sociology thing. I'm sure some sociologist here at Tech has been talking at one point in a lecture on organizational culture. I won't do that here, but had caused the failure to stop the genocide in Rwanda. So the experts, right, the technocrats, they said that was a civil war, not that it was a genocide. Which just wasn't really on the agenda of the UN, and no one really knew what was going on, because they just thought, well, it's civil war. That's not us, right? We have to remember the UN doesn't deal in civil wars, only humanitarian interventions like genocides. All right, finally, non-state actors. So finally, here we go. Non-state actors. NGOs and global civil society. Okay, so they exist at the UN, right? They're explicitly involved in lots and lots of discussions at the UN. Questions, just initial questions. Are NGOs efficient? Who do NGOs represent? Are they democratizing? What can NGOs do that the UN itself can't? Are they even there, right? How much do NGOs engage formally with the UN and where? What about informal relationships with NGOs? And why are states skeptical of NGOs? So there's a bit of a discussion here on the growth and the diversity of the kinds of NGOs since 1945. And then also some consideration about them forming a global civil society, which we could talk about. I think that's an interesting concept, that all these non-governmental organizations, they come together and they sort of create a shadow government, or the global civil society, like what the U.S. civil society is on a global scale. Eight 8,000 NGOs have an international dimension to them. But there's millions of NGOs, of course, that are exclusively just national, right? I mean, the church down the block is sort of considered a NGO, right? So that's why there's millions of them around the world. But there's 8,000, 9,000, 7,000, somewhere in that area, right, of non-governmental organizations that have an international agenda. So they naturally would gravitate toward action at the UN. The NGO, the ECOSOC gets is where the NGOs are, right? So the charter, the UN charter, says that they can have consultative status at ECOSOC. And now ECOSOC actually has procedures that accreditate, yes, NGOs um, to have sort of like official status, right? Um, so NGOs often are more important at global conferences than they are just generally. What are you doing, Millie? Come on. NGOs were able to get consultative status in the ECOSOC in the 1990s. They do a lot of humanitarian aid, so they're important potentially with Security Council actions that happen when there needs to be humanitarian intervention that the Security Council um, approves. For the most part, because the UN is only 55,000 people, right? How many people work for the US government? It's like 5 million, right? So they're happy to have NGO help, but they don't have much leverage, right? Because they're not states. It's hard for them to participate. Like they're just a different kind of thing than a state is. So even if you gave them status on the General Assembly or ECOSOC in this case, right, as like regular things, right, equal status to states, they're still not states, so they don't have all of the resources. Hey, come on. That a state would have. So they're kind of service providers. Um, Once they get a UN contract, they really try to guard it, right? They jealously guard their jurisdiction. Um, Come on. Okay, you want to go in the closet? That's fine. Uh, some states end up being pretty skeptical of NGOs, right? In part, that's because NGOs might be like a secret way for another state to intervene in their domestic politics, or they're gonna promote a religion that's not what we want, right? Or they're gonna promote democracy, and we don't want that, right? Or they're gonna promote consumerism, something, right? So even if they provide services, sometimes states are skeptical of letting NGOs come in, even if the UN says yes, they should be there. And then some NGOs are more powerful than others, right? So large ones tend to get more say than the smaller ones, which is fine, right? So we're not really sure if NGOs and their involvement in the UN is democratizing. And social movements should be considered distinct from NGOs as well, at least according to the literature. Others, last thing, academics and expert consultants, they're all over the UN. They're just not like a thing, right? Because they're all kind of individuals. Independent commissions are set up sort of ad hoc, meaning that when we need something to talk about, I should say about academic and expert consultants, they're great. And it's not just to say that we should have more of me out there, but they're good for in-depth knowledge building. If you can hire an academic or an expert consultant that can work on an issue and produce a lot of reports, then that can be pretty valuable. And a lot of these academics and expert consultants have won Nobel Prizes over the years. They're usually working pretty isolated, right, on their own, but they've done a lot of good work for the UN. Independent commissions, similar, right? So instead of academics and expert consultants, independent commissions tend to get prominent individuals involved, former heads of government, former foreign ministers, former ambassadors who are well respected, some academics as well. So you get the knowledge plus the political punch that can potentially make more things happen, right? They can make more controversial statements because they are have the political wherewithal, or the the knowledge. It's the knowledge plus the political status, right? That they have, that they can voice criticism more forcefully. And then public-private partnerships, PPPs. This is the neoliberal model, right, at the UN. So mostly the UN turns to this because the UN lacks the funding to do things on their own. So they partner with private groups, NGOs in particular areas to get things done. It's essentially the standard model now to do this, especially at specialized agencies. You also have those rich guy foundations helping out, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or now just the Melinda Gates Foundation. Ted Turner, Warren Buffett spent a lot of money on funding public-private partnerships to try to alleviate poverty mostly, and disease in the developing world. And so this plays a big role in global governance today. So when you're thinking about, oh, we have this problem in our simulation, right, that we can't really figure out, these people aren't going to be in the room for the simulation, right? But just know that they sort of exist as resources that you can vaguely refer to, right? You don't have to say, like, France is going to pay money for malaria nets. You can say mosquito nets to help prevent malaria. You can say, and I'm just saying this because that's part of what the Bill and Melinda Gates are famous for, are mosquito nets to prevent malaria, right? We can ask them to do, we can pay them to do something, or we can ask them for money, right? So these are extra resources available to the UN, right? These non-state actors who both want to do stuff, so they're motivated. They also potentially have their own agenda, so that's something to keep in mind. But resources available to the UN who are motivated to make things better. So that's good enough for this lecture, and I will probably record the other one in the morning. You don't need to know that, but thanks for checking this out. I'll see you next week.